Hey guys, so today we're going to be talking about Biffy Clyro, specifically their worst to best albums. So, Biffy Clyro's worst to best albums. This is an incredibly difficult list to make. Each album is incredible in its own way. I'm going to be talking about the worst to best albums as a whole, not specifically just because of how great a certain single is or certain singles are from certain albums. Yeet! The Vertigo of Bliss, Biffy's second album, some of the moods are sort of an adolescence, sort of rebellion theme going on. Simon Neil has claimed to have written it in a day in a previous interview, and I think in part it does show. There are some great singles on this album, you know, personal highlights being A Day Of or Eradicate the Doubt, and with some singles such as The Ideal Height or Questions and Answers. I just think as a whole, unfortunately this album feels like the most unfinished album, or it's almost like there's a longer run time than the amount of fresh ideas they produce for it. Again, the worst of an incredible bunch. So coming in at number 2 is Biffy's latest album, Ellipsis. Now for me this is a very sort of strange album in this lineup. It's definitely of a different style. I think with the album starting with Wolves of Winter, it was off to an incredible start. It's got a great blend of sort of electronic and grand elements that you saw in Puzzle. I just think that after that track it just sort of dips down and forms into what I could compare closer to a pop album, which pains me to say. Hopefully this won't be their sound for the foreseeable future and it was just trialing something and they will remain as quite a heavy band. These songs are great in their own right, but compared to the catalogue of music that they've produced up till this point, in my opinion, I just think that it's not quite on the same level, and that's why it's going to go at number 2 on the list. Some of my personal favourites off this album, as I've said, Wolves of Winter. You've got one of the deluxe tracks. Somehow this has made it to a deluxe track and not on the main line, is In the Name of the Wee Man. This is sort of everything that you would expect from a Biffy Clyro song. It's powerful, it's grand, you know, it's got all these different layers and aspects and textures to it. It's just a great song in general, really. Only Revolution. So album number 3 on this list is Only Revolutions, which might become a bit of a surprise to some of you. This is the album with their most commercial successes. You've got Bubbles, you've got Mountains, you've got Many of Horror. These are sort of the big tracks that sort of put Biffy on the map. After Puzzle, this was probably their biggest, most critically acclaimed sort of breakthrough album, which put them into the mainstream, into the charts. This is where I first heard of them, with Bubbles and Mountains back in 2008, 2009. In its own right, again, this is a great album. For me, there are certain aspects of it that are very powerful. You've got some great songs on this, as I said. You've got Many of Horror, Bubbles, you've got, in particular, That Golden Rule, but some of the sort of lesser known songs such as Horses, is that how you say it? Horses and Sky Demon are, you know, fast, heavy guitars and heavy drums, you know. Again, that Biffy sound that you sort of look for in an album, I think it's definitely there. The Captain, as an example, is another very powerful track, especially live. This album is just great to see. Again, unfortunately, it sits near the bottom of this list, just because of the other music and albums that they produced at this point. It's a great album, I'm not going to take that away from it. On to number 4. So coming in at number 4 is Biffy's 6th album, Opposites. Now this is their first double album, and in many ways this was split between the fans. It's got a lot of aspects that Only Revolutions had. It's got your big popular songs that were in the charts, such as Black Chandelier, Sounds Like Balloons, Opposite as well. Now this album for me is this high up on the list because I think it does so many things right. There are, you know, sort of front to back, there are so many catchy songs and fresh ideas, and I feel like they maybe didn't even utilise all of the fresh ideas that they had, which is why they had the B-Sides album, Similarities, which has another 16 songs which didn't quite make the album. You could tell they were full of inspiration when writing this. Now, I think in many aspects there are some really powerful songs, personal highlights being Spanish Radio, Black Chandelier as I've already mentioned, and there is a song called A Girl and His Cat, which again implements the sort of in the beginning the electronical aspects that they've used before, and I think some of the hate for this album is a little bit unjustified. I think if you were to narrow this album down to just say 9 songs, it maybe would have been more well received, they would have been less experimental about it, but I think as a whole this is definitely one of my favourite albums that they've ever produced, and I think it's got some of their best work on it. So coming in at number 5 is Blackened Sky. Now I know a lot of you diehard fans might be shocked that this isn't, you know, number 1 on the list. I think in my opinion this album, for a debut album, this is exactly what it needed to be. I think some of the production on the album for the time and for the budget and how this is their debut album, I think still holds up today. The opening track, Joy, Discovery, Invention, you know, starts off quite mellow and a little bit sort of eerie, and then it gets into the heavy distorted riffs further on in the track, and it just works so well, blends the two really well together. You can tell that the band had such a clear vision so early on in their career. I think that as a personal highlight, and also Solution Devices for myself is my favourite track, one of my favourite tracks by the band in general. I think the way that it takes the chords that it uses on the chorus and adds distortion, sort of your alternative rock sort of sound, worked absolutely perfectly. I think the lyrics on this album, you can tell, come from an adolescent place like Vertigo of Bliss, around the same era. There's a lot of dark and sort of confident elements in it, and also to the next point would be the amazing tracks that are still getting played live to this day. You've got 57, you've got 27, then there's Just Boy, which they sort of play on tour still. On the Ellipsis tour that I saw, they played Just Boy. So as a whole, this album, for the time, for their debut album, is incredibly strong. I think there are so many great ideas on it that are really well done, and that's why it's earned this place on the list. Yeah! So I think in certain aspects of this album you can definitely sense that Simon is feeling sad. The instruments often follow quite a sad path, and then it turns to anger, and there's so many different emotions that are sort of coming through in each of these songs, especially Folding Stars. I think that song initially wasn't really even supposed to be played, but I think the band members liked it so much that they sort of wanted it to be out there for the fans, so Simon sort of agreed to that. I think it's such an emotional song. Even if you don't know any of the background behind the band or who it's about, I think you can definitely pick up on the real emotions that are coming through on the song, and the sadness that's coming through as well. I think this album did incredibly well for the band. Really was their first sort of taste of commercial success for Only Revolutions, and still to this day is their second best album in my opinion. For a lot of people it's their favourite album, you know, completely subject to their own opinion. I think to this day ultimately this is one of the best albums ever written. So I think it's a big achievement in the band's sort of arsenal. This is the album that if you had never heard of the band before, this is the album to listen to first. I would say it's got less experimental stuff on it for the most part. There are some sort of concept-y bits in between songs that do definitely come through as well. Ultimately it's front to back just an incredible album. Every song is incredibly catchy on it, and it's just a great listen really. Moving on to number 7. So coming in at number 7 is, in my opinion, Biffy Clyro's best album, Infinity Land. And I think that this album really was the last of the 3 sort of early albums. You can tell they've all got a very similar theme running throughout. It's the whole adolescent theme that I've spoken about previously. I think this was a lot harder hitting than maybe the last 2 albums, but as a whole I think there are a lot of sad elements to this album too. You've got songs such as Got Wrong, and I think it's got elements of sadness in certain areas of this album. I think Got Wrong being a highlight, and I think you can definitely sense the sadness and the... So I think there are certain aspects of this album that maybe are a little bit more sort of self-aware and understanding and sort of sympathetic of other people, and reveal the sadness behind some of the aspects of these songs. Shows weakness in some areas, and I think it's definitely a very, very strong front to back set of songs, and I think to date this is probably the most experimental album. There are definitely a lot of different sort of wacky techniques that are being used. You've got the 28-minute song with probably about 25 minutes of just silence. You've got Simon reading a poem near the end. You know, you've got vocal acapellas, and you've got certain songs like Jaggy Snake, which, you know, uses a lot of sort of satanic themes to it as well, you might say. I think some of the personal highlights of this album for me is There's No Such Thing as a Jaggy Snake. I think it's just a great song. I think it's very, the energy, you can just feel it. It's, you know, probably unintentionally funny at some points. The energy for this album is, in my opinion, the highest it's been. You can just feel it, and you can hear it coming from the songs with every song. You've got Strung to Your Ribcage, another great song on this album. Definitely explores a lot of the themes of sort of going mad, and there's also self-doubt again. I think another personal favourite off this album is Some Kind of a Wizard. I think it's very interesting. A lot of the songs on this album are very intricate. The guitar playing is a lot more complex, and I really appreciate that about the band. It's almost like they were on an uphill slope, getting heavier and heavier with each album, and I think in this case it just works really well. It really fits the piece and exactly what they were going for. One of my favourite parts of this album is actually the artwork that they used behind it. I really like the sort of gas mask and the way that the whole composition looks. I think it just works incredibly well. One day I'm going to get this tattooed on me, probably. You know, massive fan of the artwork. Got my own custom Biffy Clyro clock up there. So I think as a whole, Biffy Clyro have one of the strongest set of albums that any band could produce, because each album has not just one but many memorable singles. They were going for something new with every album, and they were trying to top the last album with each one that comes out. And from everything you see about them, they're so humble and they interact with their fans, which is, you know, incredibly appreciative. I think, yeah, that's all I've got to really say today. So Infinity Land is my favourite Biffy Clyro album. Thank you for watching, and subscribe.